Hello there, my name is Luis Chamon, and in this video I'm going to show you a new way to deal with uncertainty in the context of control and dynamical systems. There are many sources of uncertainty in dynamical systems, such as modeling and external disturbances, that affect both the performance and feasibility of a controller. The typical way to deal with this problem is to use robust controllers that are designed to remain operational regardless of the disruption. In other words, they are hard to break. There are several methods to design controllers that achieve robustness under different criteria. However, while planning for every contingency guarantees that the system operates within its specifications, it typically leads to conservative designs that have poor performance even in favorable conditions. In some extreme cases, conflicting requirements might even make the design infeasible. The question then is no longer how to deal with a certain level of disturbance, but what to do when things go so catastrophically wrong that the original desired equilibrium is no longer viable. The only way out in this case is to modify the system operation in order to find an alternative equilibrium. In ecology, this property is known as resilience. So rather than trying to operate as specified under every condition, a resilient controller will adapt its specifications to disruptions in order to reduce their impact. In other words, resilient systems are easy to fix rather than hard to break. Now, contrary to robustness, there is no general theory of resilience in control. It is often achieved using ad hoc solutions, and in many cases, it is conflated with robustness. However, I want to stress that these are in fact strikingly different behaviors. So let's consider the slightly less cartoonish problem of the lazy shepherd. I said it would be slightly less cartoonish. I promise I'll get to some more realistic applications with drones towards the end of the video. Here, a shepherd needs to care for sheep uniformly distributed on the field, but can only really cover 80% of the area. Now, the shepherd is neither interested in walking around, nor straying too far away from the main house because, well, that's the lazy part. Now, what would a robust shepherd do? Well, it would simply walk until 80% of the field is covered and stop. So if a sheep tries to run away, the shepherd can be quite far from it. A resilient shepherd, on the other hand, takes that into account and decides to walk a little more in order to make sure that even though it won't cover the whole field, it will never be too far from any sheep. Okay, so now that we understand what resilience actually is, let's see how we can obtain this kind of behavior in generic, non-cartoonish optimal control problems. Take the classical LQR problem, for example. Now, we will account for uncertainty by using a random variable xi that describes, for example, the loss of an actuator or a change in the dynamics due to a gush of wind. Since our theory applies beyond this sample LQR, I'm going to abstract this problem and suppose that we want to minimize some control cost subject to a set of constraints that depend on the disturbance. Notice that since the disturbances are random variables, the feasibility set of this problem is random, and its solution therefore depends on the unknown realization of xi. To get a deterministic controller, robustness sets out to find a single solution that is feasible for most realizations of the disturbance. We can formalize this problem using a chance constraint, which essentially fixes the feasibility set. By reducing delta, we make the design more and more conservative until the problem simply becomes infeasible. Now, resilience takes a different approach. Rather than trying to be feasible for most realizations, it seeks to be mostly feasible for all realizations. So the resilient formulation modifies the feasibility set to accommodate each disturbance. Great idea, but how? Clearly, there are choices of the relaxation S that lead to behavior that are not at all useful. The key idea here is that resilience needs to achieve two conflicting goals. The first is to mostly satisfy the original specifications, which implies that S should be small. The second is to improve the performance, which implies that S should be large so as to increase the feasibility set. Ideally, we would like to find a relaxation that balances these two objectives. To do that, we're going to introduce a resilience cost H that quantifies the constraint violation and set out to find an S star such that if we were to further relax the constraints, we would gain as much performance as we would have to pay to do so. Notice that this price also depends on the probability of the disturbance, so the system can violate specifications more aggressively for unlikely disturbances. Putting everything together gives us an optimal control problem we call resilience by compromise. Now, while we have argued that this is a sane formulation, it is not immediately clear what kind of resilient behavior it induces, how it is related to robustness, and how we could go about solving this problem in practice. So let's answer this question starting with the first one. Now, it turns out that resilience by compromise relaxes each constraint depending on its dual variable, which is exactly what we want to do. Since these are convex problems, we know that the dual variables are a measure of constraint satisfaction difficulty. So the resilient controller actually focuses on those requirements that are harder to meet. Obviously, the resilience slacks also depend on the likelihood of the disturbance and on the structure of the resilience cost. Using a quadratic cost, for example, leads to relaxations that are directly proportional to the dual variables. So the resilient controller violates constraints according to the difficulty of satisfying them. This begs the question of whether there exists a resilience cost that would make the resilient controller act as a robust one. And in fact, there is. By choosing a hard cost that rewards the system for being feasible, but doesn't penalize it for how infeasible it gets, we recover a robust optimal controller. This means that although robustness and resilience are different properties, robustness can be seen as a particular case of resilience, or resilience as a soft form of robustness. So depending on the problem, we might be inclined to have both features by being robust with respect to critical constraints and resilient with respect to soft nominal ones. The last question we need to answer is how do we actually operationalize resilience, which we can do using a modified Arrow-Hurwicz algorithm. Now, if we knew S beforehand, we could simply use a primal dual approach and alternate between updating the control variable z using gradient descent and the dual variable lambda using gradient ascent. The problem is that we don't know S. But what we know is how it is related to the dual variables, a relation that we can use to directly update lambda for the resilience slack. This algorithm can actually be shown to converge using similar arguments as for the traditional Arrow-Hurwicz one. Okay, now that we know how to design resilient controllers, let's get to that drone application I promised. Our problem here is going to be to plan the actions of a drone to navigate around a corridor through given waypoints while remaining within a safe distance of the walls. At the end of the corridor, the drone may find a box standing between it and its destination. We have no idea beforehand if the box is there, and if it is a light, a medium, or a heavy one. Now, a robust plan that ensures the drone attains its target in 90% of the cases will provide enough thrust to push the light box, but give up and fail on the medium and heavy ones in order to satisfy its thrust limits. The resilient planner, however, is allowed to relax two requirements: the maximum thrust and the terminal set. In other words, it can choose between pushing harder or stopping early. Now, the drone is prepared to push even the medium box into the terminal set. But when it comes to the heavy box, it chooses to push it closer, but not all the way. Another interesting thing to notice here is that the resilient controller uses some additional thrust in the beginning in order to hug the safety set and reduce its overall control cost. This showcases the fact that resilience does not only act to fix problems. Sometimes it relaxes a requirement because the performance gains outweigh the costs. This is actually quite desirable in the case of nominal requirements that can withstand sporadic violations, such as thrust limits. Before you go, let me just recap what we saw in this video. We first talked about the difference between robustness and resilience by pointing out that robust systems remain feasible for most disturbances, so they are hard to break, whereas resilient systems are mostly feasible for all disturbances, so they are easy to fix. We formalized this concept in the context of optimal control and went over how to design resilience by compromising between feasibility and performance. When analyzing the behavior of this formulation, we found out that not only is robustness indeed different from resilience, but it is in fact a hard form of resilience. Although we mostly discussed the problem of planning to be resilient here, we also show in the paper how this approach can be taken online using MPC. You can find more information, including details on the experiments, in the extended version on arXiv and on my website below.